Education, and Evan and myself would like to welcome you here to the Lorna Hub for the launch of the One Voice for Language. You're very, very welcome. Before we start, there's just a couple of housekeeping matters that I'd like to run through with you. Firstly, there are two emergency exits, one here behind me and one the door which you came through. So in the event of an alarm going off or any other instance, would you please make your way in an orderly fashion through one or other of these two exits. I recommend that one. This one does also take you out. In terms of bathroom facilities, then there's a toilet just through there, and there are a couple more just through here. If you use this one, these facilities here, you may have problem reaccessing this space. Bang on the door and you immediately let you back. Though they're very clean, that's mainly it. I hope you're all comfortable and have enough bedroom and enough air in the space. If there's ever a shortage of air, please indicate it and I'll try and open some of the windows. That's the housekeeping done, and Evitt is going to welcome you again.
Agreed Lucia, I'm the Torja, Gordon, Kate, Falcha, a Corroy Pilaire, Galosh and a Trinoja, the no card fierce the shield the shop, nor Fjolford and Cador on Grupa Nuasha, One Voice for Languages. They done Grupa, Egg Finu, or Son Last, the Changafa, Egg Sulenair. Fasulgum, the Munishiv, Galair, on a sulk, spree, as some chocolate kale shop.
I'm going to just say a very few words and then we're going to hand over to the coordinating committee of the One Voice for Languages who are going to be the kind of master ceremonies, as it were, of the evening. Just in my capacity as host, I want to speak for 2 minutes, if you bear with me. In Ireland we have 2 official languages. From our experience, either within the family or at least from day one in the primary sector, we grow up aware that we have 2 languages. And our collective and individual identities are fashioned by our 2 languages. We teach a handful of languages in the post-primary, further and higher education sectors. These are the so-called curricular languages. The number of languages increases as we move through the education system. We move outwards in our offerings from Western European languages through the languages of Central and Eastern Europe onto the languages of Asia and the Far East. Beyond the walls of the education system, in our homes and on our streets, there are somewhere between 160 and 200 languages being spoken. That we don't know exactly how many is itself of significance. 160 says the last census, but that is only because it's only capable of counting as far as 3. English, Irish and 1 other. On the basis of her research, Anne Gallagher from Maynooth says probably anything up to 200. But even not knowing their number, we do know this. Languages connect. On this tiny island, we have huge cultural and linguistic wealth, which enables us to connect with people, family, friends, colleagues and business associates all over the world. And we also know we're not very good at nurturing, maintaining or transmitting this wealth. So we must ask, if we fail to provide language support, how many languages will we speak in 10 or 20 years' time? One Voice is about inviting people, you, me, our elected representatives, educators and the media, to reflect on how many languages define us as individuals and as a community, and what we can do to nourish and preserve. We have this magnificent array of languages. We are rich, even in these days of recession. But, and there's always a but, As well we know from our past, languages not only connect, they also divide. One Voice is an initiative which speaks with one voice on behalf of all the languages of and in Ireland, about the benefits to our well-being as individuals, as much as social, cultural, political and economic actors involved in the business of fashioning the kind of country and possibly even world we want for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you for your attention.
Another very few quick words from the hosts here from Trinity College. We're very proud to host this event and to be part of this group. And so Sarah said, languages connect. And this is exactly how One Voice came into being. And you all here are a testament to the diversity of interests that we aim to represent. There's people here from different sectors, different levels of the education system, different languages, and all of these we feel we want to draw together. And in putting this together, we have many, many people to thank. And first of all, I'd like to greatly thank our sponsors for this evening, the Service Culturel of the French Embassy, the Consejería de Educación of the Spanish Embassy, the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany in Dublin, the Embassy of Switzerland, the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Dublin, SAP SSC in Ireland, the German Studies Association of Ireland, and Bilingual Forum Ireland. So there's a wide range of languages there, a wide range of organisations, and we are so thankful for the support that you're showing us by your presence here and by your sponsorship. We would also like to thank, of course, the Trinity Long Room Hub, led by Professor Jürgen Barkov, Professor Barkov, for the use of this venue and for lending to us. This is an initiative which ties in well, I feel, with the aims of the Institute here. I'd also like to thank very, very much the staff of the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultural Studies, in particular Connie Offitz, for her help in putting this together. And I cannot thank enough the staff of the School of Education, in particular Valerie Kelly, and I can't see here, and Catherine O'Rourke, for their amazing attention to detail and their wonderful organisational skills in putting this into practice. Without them, we'd be utterly lost. Certainly the committee members of the One Voice for Languages group, and the names of all are on the bottom of your mission statement. We, if I say so myself, we are a shining example of multilingual, multicultural team working. And if there's an industry out there that wants a team that can put something together, we're your lads. And with a range of languages into the bargain. So many thanks to them. Particular thanks to our chair, Kristen Brogan, for keeping everything moving and on target since we kind of started putting this together. And also many thanks to our interpreter, Susan Kay. So now I'm going to hand over for the evening to Kristen and Tanya, who are going to moderate the evening and talk us a little bit through this. Kristen Brogan is the chair of OBFL, and Tanya Flanagan is a post-primary teacher of French and Italian and formerly the national coordinator of the Modern Languages Primary School Initiative. And we're so grateful to have you here to do this.
Okay. It's okay. Back on track. Great. I would like to offer a really warm welcome to all of you who are gathering here tonight. And it's wonderful to see so many who made it to be here at our event. And hopefully this is the first of many. And I'm looking forward to it already. Of course, I would like highly to thank Trinity College for hosting it, because it's such a nice event and, very comfortable, and we have definitely an interesting time for the next hour. I again also want to emphasize how grateful we are to our sponsors. Without, that support, this event again wouldn't have happened. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues gathered here tonight who have been very supportive already in the past. So just to give you a short idea of where we were coming from, the history, we go back a couple of many years, and I would like to start mentioning the IoT's Languages Strategy Group together with my colleague Rina Walsh, because there already we were looking at the concept languages have to work together. It's not each institute of technology on their own, and we're not in competition, but let's unite and already create a voice. And then in November 2011, 2 years ago, we had, and you can hear the difference, it was a voice for languages. And I again have to thank gratefully my colleague Barbara Gaharty, because her input was very valuable to get the first gathering started there in November 2011 and bringing it to a wider level. And the circle closes because Tony Donohue at that time in November 2011 gave us the launch of the EU project Languages for Jobs, not Jobs for Languages, Languages for Jobs, the EU report, which was providing multilingualism communication skills for the labor market. And again, we were just amazed how wonderful the response was of colleagues and friends attending this. Also, back in November 2011, my thanks go to Jerry O'Sullivan from the HGA, because he at that time was actually providing the venue for us to meet. And it was an attempt to bring different sectors together within education, and the key message of the Languages for Job EU report was cooperation between the education sector and businesses, and that was our first attempt. Then we had further meetings, and again, if I may mention my colleague Eileen Pearson-Evans, because in DCU was again holding a very important event. We had an event in UL, numerous gatherings at Trinity College, and again trying to cooperate together with IRAL, GSAI, Force, shouldn't say Force anymore, I think it's Solace, isn't it? Enterprise Ireland, IBEC, some of the companies, SAP again, the circle closes, you have seen them as one of our sponsors, IBM, the Culture Institutes, and representatives from the secondary language associations as well, just to name a few. So you can get a feeling this didn't just happen in a day. So hopefully that should be a reflection on the quality. So we're coming a long way. In the edition, in relation to our lovely leaflet that you all hopefully got on your chair, I just wanted to make a few short points. Just what's important for us. The message, we cannot say it often enough, English is not enough. English is going to become a basic skill. We need to give our young people a wide skill mix, and that includes languages. And learning languages does not mean we are preparing our youngsters to go abroad. It means there are languages here in Ireland with language requirements, and they cannot be filled. Enterprise Ireland, Solace, Force, media reports have highlighted that a long time ago. Another point that's very valuable for us, very dear to us, is language learning will display an attitude. It's all about raising awareness of the value of language learning and cultural awareness, because they go hand in hand. And it's just, you know, in 30 years that I'm living on this island, I'm just amazed of sometimes the negative attitude that you encounter about languages. You know, offering business, entrepreneur, tourism courses without a choice of languages. Or again, Erasmus students going abroad having such a negative attitude to languages, oh, we can't improve it and we just speak in English anyway, which is such a pity. And may I mention, there was just recently an event in London, a language event, and the conference title was No Island is an Island. And again, doesn't that display attitude and languages? And I'm just back today from an EU project meeting in Finland, and didn't miss a plane. I'm very grateful for that. And my Finnish partner, Omnia, got an award for the best vocational college in Finland. And part of this award, they're emphasizing internationalization. And part of internationalization is the value of languages and the appreciation of language learning and teaching. And when I'm just mentioning that, in the primary sector we have English and Irish and no other languages, they're always a little bit amazed. But let's stay in the positive side. We would like to create a discussion on the role of languages in Ireland, specifically in the education sector. We would like to emphasize that we are inclusive of all languages. We want to bring together different sectors. We want to bring together education and business. We would like to create a dialogue, and we all will benefit from this. So it's up to you. If you give us your support to our group, then you can help us to have an impact on the development of a multilingual Ireland where languages are appreciated and one is encouraged to learn languages. Before I hand over to my colleague Tanya, I would like to introduce the committee members for One Voice of Languages. And please, if you be so kind and show your faces. Susanna Nocchi is our secretary. She is hopefully, somewhere around at the back. And then Niamh Nestor, another very important role to fill, our treasurer, and standing right beside Susanna. Then Tanya Flanagan is very familiar to you because you would have to reply to her emails. So our communication officer, but she also is a link to the post-primary sector. And I just want to give you an idea how diverse our committee is. And then we have our colleague Deirdre Kirwan, and she is our link to the primary sector. And David, who already spoke earlier on, and together with Marie-Therese Batardier is the link to the higher education sector. Yeah, thank you. And then we have Christiane Schönfeld. Yes, over there. And she is a link to the colleges of education, which are all presented today, which is just fabulous. So I have to thank again this wonderful team for working so well together in a positive spirit. Again, I would like to thank you for being here, and I would like to invite you with us to enjoy this evening. And as I said, hopefully this is the first event of many. Thank you so much.
Screen? Okay. I am both honoured and humbled to have been asked to follow on from both the generous welcome from our colleagues and hosts Sarah and Anne here in TCD and our committee chair Carson, and to facilitate our panel discussion this evening. Carson has outlined how almost 2 years to the day since our first meeting at the launch of the Languages for Jobs report in the HEA, we are now in the proud position of being able to launch a unified and comprehensive advocacy group to promote the importance of language learning for this country. We are here because language learning is in a precarious position. In the educational context, there are issues at primary, at post-primary and at third level. Our policy of teaching English and Irish at primary and post-primary level has been referred to as our official but lame bilingualism in recent EU Commission reports. Since the ending of the Modern Languages in Primary Schools initiative, the MLPSI in 2012, we are now the only country in the EU where the learning of non-Indigenous languages has no place in the formative primary curriculum. The learning of the traditional established European languages continues at second level, and while some inroads have been made thanks to the Post-Primary Languages Initiative in terms of promotion and diversification, the popularity of language learning remains a constant concern. Recently, this concern has been further exacerbated in the eyes of many by some of the proposals for junior cert reform. Despite clear recommendations from the Language Policy Division of the Council of Europe in 2008 for the urgent development of a coherent and comprehensive languages and education policy, even the draft policy initiated by department officials has never been published. One related event will be the NCCA's language strategy for the primary sector, which is due to be published in 2014, but we know already that it will focus solely on English and Irish. Can we really foster a multilingual Ireland in this way? At third level too, there are concerns that not enough of our graduates have the requisite language and intercultural skills to enable them to confidently compete for the many career opportunities that exist in the Irish and global marketplaces for plurilingual professionals. Our business leaders bemoan the fact that they must recruit for many multilingual positions abroad, as they simply cannot source Irish graduates with the necessary level of language competency. And yet, as has already been alluded to, we know that as a country, Ireland has never been as multilingual, with over 160 languages spoken here daily. There are vibrant language projects in schools, colleges and community groups all over the country. There are very active parent-led language groups, many of whom we are delighted to welcome here this evening. There are committed language teacher associations who do sterling work in terms of offering opportunities for CPD, networking and the invaluable sharing of expertise and resources. Indeed, I will be very happily attending the Italian Teachers Association annual conference this coming Saturday. But yet, as a society, we do not seem to have grasped a true appreciation of the value of languages. For example, and I'm sure many of you will have read this, there was a lengthy article in the education pages of last Tuesday's Irish Times about the opportunities and advantages of studying in a European university, either for a year or for a full degree programme. Learning the language of that country wasn't even mentioned. Indeed, the word language didn't appear at all. But to return to our own country and our own education system, regrettably we are still awaiting formal government policy and strategy which would see language learning become an integral element in terms of education, the economy, cultural identity and social cohesion. This evening sees the coming together for the first time of educationalists from all sectors, embassies, cultural institutes, parents groups, business leaders and policy makers, in the hope that together we can begin the process of securing a firm commitment from government to provide the necessary platform for languages so that Irish society as a whole can realise how much there is to be gained by giving languages a voice. Above all, we would like to hear your voices. So while there will be an open discussion following our panels of guest speakers, each of you should have a comment card on your seat. And we would invite you to express your vision for languages for the future, your ideas, your suggestions, your priorities. How can one voice for languages support you and your organisation and speak on your behalf? And there's a box at the end of the room where you can leave your card. They're these ones. But we must look forward. As was written in a letter to the Irish Times recently on the subject of this evening's launch, we are the most gregarious people in the world and natural linguists, we just don't know it yet. But now, back to the main event of this evening. I think the importance of our task is admirably reflected in the calibre of our panel of guest speakers. Each guest will speak in turn and we will then open the discussion to the floor for your comments and suggestions. Our first speaker is Professor Finbarr Bradley. Professor Bradley teaches risk management at the UCD Smurfit Graduate Business School, while also running innovation programmes in a number of Irish and international companies. Throughout his academic career, he has been instrumental in the establishment of many specialised programmes and supports for young entrepreneurs, and has published extensively in the areas of finance, economics and culture. We are honoured that he is able to open our discussion this evening. I know he has spoken already today on the subject in an interview with Radio na Gaeltachta this morning, so I would ask you to join with me in welcoming him to the podium. Thank you.
Now, with so much screening that Kristen was talking about the wonderful screening process you have. How I ever got through, I don't know. And hopefully at the end of I think I have 8 to 9 minutes. Is that correct?
You actually have to stop me, you know.
Oh, very good. Well, I have at most 4 slides, and so that's it. And my views are a bit unorthodox. The word language may not come in that often, but hopefully you'll see that it's actually all about languages, all about what I think is really the core argument and the great opportunity, and that's why I'm so honoured to be asked. But I started off by showing it's based on some work that I've done with my US colleague. I've written a few books over the last few years on sort of culture, competitiveness, authenticity, sense of place, etc. And I started off with a little quote from a French education philosopher, which kind of captures the spirit of what are we talking about, because a lot of I get invited to talk to a lot of people from the arts world and the crafts world, and I think one of the big mistakes they make, and as a person whose background I've spent many years in many economics and finance departments around the world, I think the basic mistake that's made a lot of times is to make an economic argument in the short term, because I think it always means you're exposed to other people making better economic arguments. I think the value here can be captured better by making an argument based on something far deeper, and hopefully I'll be able to capture that in my 7 or 8 minutes. And as you can see from the quote, I said the trouble, and it's not me, the trouble with purely utilitarian education is that it's not utilitarian enough. And the reason I started with that is that because a lot of times people assume that if you can show that there's jobs available or that there's certain skills that are needed, and I remember, I'm old enough to remember 20 or 30 years ago, people were saying, oh, Japanese was the great, we should all be doing Japanese. Again, my goal, and let me make it very clear, is that everybody should know every language of every country in the world. But we also have to be reasonable. So what I'm really saying is, I think there's a far deeper argument, a far more potent argument, which I hope I'll make in my few minutes left. And I started off in my first slide by talking about the area that I've done a lot of work in the last few years and taught a lot and feel it is actually comes to the core of the argument. And I called it the emerging economy. I mean, there is a lot of problems. It won't come up tonight, maybe tomorrow, with our present form of our capitalistic model, if you will, or global model. And I think there is an emerging economy, an economy that is actually your greatest argument, I believe. And I called it a smart, sustainable, successful society. I sort of stole some of the terms from government policymakers. They use the word smart a lot. I teach green business, so sustainable, certainly, and successful. You should start off with a society rather than an economy. And it's, again, one of the big battles I've had with my own colleagues in various economics departments. So the purpose of an economy is quality of life, or what I'm trying to capture here better, a learning economy, that is the ability to, if you will, dynamically grow in such a way that you allow people to reach their potential. And I threw in a few terms, and hopefully I'm not going to go through them all, but I think it captures the spirit of what I'm talking about. That the concept of an economy, the old way of thinking about an economy, a sort of a rational model, a sort of almost a machine, it's far better to think of an economy, and these terms capture it very well, I think, as more an organism rather than a machine. That is, it's about growth and development and about dynamism and interaction. And if you look on the left-hand side, what I showed is to show you sort of pictures of what I'm talking about. I showed sort of, in a crude way, social networks. It's sort of Facebook and Google and all this. If you look at it, and as you said, I teach value and teach where the value is. And more the value is in the intangible. If you look at the value of Facebook or Twitter or any of these, it's not really in the technology. I think that's one of the fundamental mistakes made by policymakers. They assume that if you can sort of give people science and mathematics, that somehow that will create, as they call it, a knowledge or smart economy. Whereas the value more and more is in things like trust, relationships. You see the terms I'm using there. Customized, personalized. It's about independence, about relationships. Do I like you? Do I get on with you? It's more to do with the, if you will, the heart rather than the head. It's to do with wholeness and integrity. So that trust, something that will come in as I talk about multilingualism in a second, and the great potential for yourselves. It's really where the value is. And you don't generate that, in many ways you don't generate it by teaching people. You create an environment where it emerges out of the sort of, if you will, the community that you create. Food, you see the same thing. My second little example. If you look at food, more and more it's about how animals are raised, where the where the food came from, what's the meaning of the food. And I hope I'm not saying anything wrong here, but in the Western world, people don't eat too much anymore to stay alive. They eat because they eat certain foods and eat in certain places because of the relationship between them and the food. Again, the French know this very well with terms like terroir, etc. Fashion. I do a lot of, you wouldn't believe it, I do actually some work in craft with fashion. And again, it's who made the thing. What's my relationship with the garment that I wear, etc. It's not actually the physical thing at all. It's about the meaning it has for me. And on the right-hand side, to prove that I'm not the one who actually thought it, I showed you a little example from Apple. And if anybody who knows anything about Apple will know that the value, Steve Jobs, this great guru in business, knew very well that it was to do with design. Again, a lot to do with meaning. And he quit college, if anybody who read his story knows, and did calligraphy, or studied Japanese or Chinese calligraphy. So I put down underneath it an example of old Irish manuscripts. Now, if you told Irish business people that they might be better off having students study that rather than a lot of the subjects, they would think you were crazy. But in many ways, it is to do with what I said, meaning. You've got to create an environment where people, the real value, as I said, is in the meaning the thing has for me. So the big resource, and I captured it there with my little arrow, in Ireland, and it ties in very much into your organisation, is to create a global sense of place. That is, you have to do both at the same time. You have to create a sense that we're all part, and we all know this from the internet, we're all part of the one world now. Everything is interlinked. I know it from my finance classes. I teach international financial markets. I've taught it for 25 years. It's all about interconnection. And yet, it's also about the local. The local, in a way, as we become more globalized, the local is becoming more important, because that's actually where the value more and more is. So how do you, if you will, dance between those two worlds? And the real skill is to create that shared sense of place by focusing on both at the same time. Being global, being international, understanding, as you said earlier, Tanya, understanding other cultures, having empathy, relationships. Look at my terms that I'm using, relationships, cooperation. And I tried to capture it in my third slide with what I think is the real essence of your argument, if I may be presumptuous, because I'm no language person. I get invited to things, as I said, about the arts, and here I am as a language, or no linguist by any stretch of the imagination, and yet I think there is something very relevant in this diagram. So let me just explain it in my couple of minutes. I said earlier that the real issue is, in value, is creating meaning, sharing meaning. So the old way of thinking about education, and again, I'm in an environment where educationalists know far more about this than myself. It's really no longer about the individual, in a sense. It's about the individual within a context, within a team, within a community, having relationships with others. It's creating that, if you will, that milieu, as I called it up in the top. So the old way of thinking, and unfortunately a lot of our policymakers still think, they still use terms like research and smart economy, yet they're thinking in an industrial age way of thinking, in a factory model way of thinking. And in fact, we have designed our schools in many ways based on the same principle. That is, that the teacher in some way is up at the front and the students down in the main hall, just like a factory where the boss is doing all the thinking. So what I'm trying to show here is that in this new world, in this emerging world, in this sustainable age, in the information age, or whatever term you want to use, really the value more and more is in, it's not a question of the arts versus the sciences. Again, a mistake that's sometimes made. It's not a question of a battle. It's a question of integrating the two. And I called it up at the door, how do you create in a way the circle I have down, or the oval shape I have down at the bottom? I said information and knowledge. They're not as valuable unless you can integrate them in some way with the ones that I've shown up on the top part, which is to do with the heart, the soul, with emotions. And as I pointed out, really, and again I'm talking to educationalists, the real challenge in education is not about giving students knowledge or giving them information. It's actually to help them to transform themselves. So, and in the environments that I've been involved in various innovative, creative environments, the real challenge is to create a community, a milieu, where everybody coming with different perspectives. In fact, ambiguity is the real value. So having an ambiguous environment, I've said that wrong, is actually the most potent way of creating an innovative economy. So I put down on the right, and I think, as language people, you know this far better than myself, I said ambiguity is the key. The old way of thinking was that there's one right answer, there's one way of doing it. What you really want to do is create the opposite, if you will. What you want to do is create an environment where people coming from with different, in this case here, I said syntax and semantics. Now these are terms that you know far better than myself. The old way of thinking was to focus on grammar, and the new way of thinking is to focus on the meaning, on semantics. So that, and again in innovation, an old way of thinking was about the rational, about analysis, about having an answer, solving problems. The new way is interpreting. Again, a word that you know far better than myself. And I finish off, and I appreciate the time you gave me, is to show a diagram. I was giving a talk at the Isle of Skye a few months ago, and this person from Wales, an MP, put up this diagram, which I think captured sort of where Irish is. And unfortunately, a lot of times the people in Ireland assume that, well, if you can sort of, it's holding us back and we won't be multilingual unless in some way we focus more on foreign languages and, Irish isn't very valuable. I've just pointed out, I hope, that in fact in the world I've just described, Irish is as valuable as any other language. In fact, it is only this world where all the languages themselves are in some sort of a dance, as I used the term earlier, that you will find the potency. So I believe myself the problem, and this person from Wales pointed it out in talking about Welsh, is that Irish is probably somewhere down near the bottom on the left-hand side, but in fact, in my own view, and that we will only truly become multilingual. We'll only truly become what we all want in this room, this great, dynamic, wonderful society where all these languages are in some sort of relationship with each other, if we can actually have that great meaning that I talked about earlier. So, and I pointed out at the end that, and again a far greater mind than myself said this, meaning is the new money, is what he said. And I'll finally finish off by talking about Barbara's role. And in fact, is the great tragedy is that here we are in Europe, where what I've just spent the last 5 or 10 minutes talking about is what Europe's greatest strength is. This environment that you can create where all of these languages are in some sort of dynamic.
Thank you very much, Professor Bradley. I think you've given us a very special and diverse aspect of our arguments this evening, and certainly one that I think has enriched our thought processes for the evening. I remember a thought struck me when you were speaking there about when I was in school, which is a long time ago. When I was in school and you wanted to study languages or specialise in languages, everybody assumed you were going to be a teacher. Whereas now you can be studying languages and be a specialist in the sciences, in law, in medicine, in commerce, in so many areas, and languages are such a complementary skill, and I think you captured that very succinctly. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Lorna Carson, and Lorna is Assistant Professor in Applied Linguistics here in Trinity College, Dublin. Her research and teaching focus on multilingualism and classroom language learning within the School of Linguistic Speech her research and teaching focus on multilingualism and classroom language is here within the School of Linguistic Speech and Communication Sciences. She has also worked as an English language teacher and researcher and is an experienced curriculum designer and administrator, and she is responsible for TCD's institution-wide language programme, its English for Academic Purposes programme and its Asian Studies programme. So in such a busy and charged diary, we are very pleased that you have found time to speak with us this evening. So, Dr. Lorna Carson.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Kirsten. Your Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow speakers. Firstly, let me express my appreciation for the invitation to participate in this official launch today. It's really an honour to speak on the subject of language learning in Ireland. And our venue is a particularly appropriate location for the event. This Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute, this beautiful building, and only one of 5 flagship research institutes in college, started its existence as a sort of synergistic idea to link Trinity's 7 arts and humanities schools and to promote and disseminate innovative research. And today this event brings together the School of Education,
the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultural Studies, and the School of Linguistic, Speech and Communication Sciences, my own school, around this cross-disciplinary theme of language learning. From ideas in arts and humanities grew this signature building, and it offers space, funding, coffee, and more to researchers in its member schools. This supportive environment harnesses and expands the excellence of Trinity's arts and humanities research. And one of its prime aims is to serve as a focal point for debates on key social challenges and the contributions that the arts and humanities can make in addressing them. And that brings me to language learning. It's always tricky to know how to pitch a short speech at an opening event of this kind. Often speakers have favourite topics, especially academic speakers, and these are squeezed into the theme of the day, like ugly sister's feet in Cinderella's glass slipper. And just to be clear, one voice for languages is the glass slipper. Equally common are the types of speeches which essentially dispense free but often unwelcome advice to a fledgling organisation. I will try to avoid both approaches today, but I may utterly fail. And rather, I'm going to try to unpick 3 features of language learning in Ireland that seem to occur, perhaps in different guises, but recognisable in almost every newspaper article, opinion piece, and dinner conversation on language in our country, and which touch on the perceived value of language learning, the demands of language learning, and on the profile of language learning. Well, the perceived value of language learning is a well-rehearsed topic where the words transferable or soft skills, flexibility, mobility, creativity appear. The words lack of may appear next to some of these words in an Irish context in terms of the skills that graduates require for jobs. And further lacks in our university, for example, are expressed in terms of the numbers of our students who participate in exchange programs or internships, or who are qualified to apply for the very jobs that call for these skills. So there is a perceived and indeed quantifiable value in language learning. But we Irish tend to shrug our shoulders, as Tanya said, and say those exchanges or internships or jobs, they're not for us. We're not linguists. We struggle with languages. And I think part of the problem is that we are currently concentrating on a value in language learning that simply cannot be perceived by students who are not enjoying or benefiting from the process of learning a language. And where the emphasis is placed on the deferred benefits of the eventual products of language learning, those are projected needs down the line, learners' actual needs in the language classroom or in the meet-up group or wherever they're learning are not sufficiently addressed. So the perceived and much vaunted values of language learning, which are of course real and indeed financial, exist, but until the language classroom becomes a place where learners want to be and where they want to speak out, it's unlikely that they will engage in the process of getting to grips with another tongue. So we have much work to do in promoting the value of the product of language learning. But in order to do that, we must also address the very process of how languages are learned. And this is linked to my second point, the demands of teaching and learning. And I spend much of my time here in Trinity engaging with teachers who take our MPhil in applied linguistics or English language teaching. Much of my own research is classroom-based, and most of my PhD students are involved in similar projects in language pedagogy. And despite this academic scrutiny, the professionalism of language teachers across the country, as well as the work of groups such as the French Teachers Association, the GDI, the Japanese Teachers Association, and Italian and so forth, language teaching and learning is generally misunderstood in the public realm and often demoted. It's just language. Teachers are cultural mediators. Sure, nowadays with the internet, students can teach themselves. And instantly, after a few years in a country, people are described as entirely fluent. She's totally bilingual. The travel writer and linguist George Burrow wrote rather acerbically in 1851, "We are at the commencement of a philological age. Everyone studies languages. That is, everyone who is fit for nothing else." And the fairly slow, usually uneven, and almost always laborious process of language learning is not considered in these assertions, nor is the fact that language teachers, unlike other teaching professionals, are teaching simultaneously a psychological tool and a symbol that mediates our thinking and our material world. How to address these understandings of what really goes on in the process of learning a new language, especially among teachers and adults, is something I'm guessing you will be addressing. Part of the answer may be found in my third point, related to the low profile of language learning in Ireland and the need to talk openly and loudly about the processes that really help us learn languages successfully, as well as envisaging realistic outcomes for our students. In the institution-wide language programme that I administer here in college, and we teach about 12 different languages, one of the most rewarding aspects is to hear students during their regular group projects start to speak to each other in the language that they're learning, and they organise their activities through German or Irish or Korean or Japanese or Turkish. And the corridors in the arts building here every evening are filled with these voices, and after the language classes they're practising things, making mistakes, rewording, checking their understanding with their friends. And in Dublin more generally, the profile of language learning has been enhanced by the growth of meet-up groups, of language exchanges and other informal projects, which have normalised the experience of speaking another language in public where you may actually be heard and even understood by another person. So part of the problem here in Ireland, I think, when gaining confidence in speaking a language is that you inevitably make mistakes. Mistakes that you may even be aware of exactly at the same time as you utter them. And this means that the native speaker model of language learning continues to hold many learners in thrall. So rather than concentrating on simply getting your idea across or communicating as much as you need to, at whatever level of accuracy is appropriate for the activity in hand, what happens? Part of the process of enhancing language learning must involve normalising the processes that this entails. The mistakes, the approximations, and the messages that we do manage to transmit, rather than exclusively focusing on an ultimate destination. We learn a language through using the language, and using a language means speaking the language. So to draw these 3 points together, I believe that the processes of learning a language changes lives for the better. And in my experience as a curriculum designer, I also believe that language learning must be rewarding. Not necessarily fun in every conjugation or embarrassing use of a false friend, but ultimately a tool and a psychological resource that brings us into contact with new ways of thinking and doing and being. And here I'm preaching to the choir. One Voice for Languages very clearly sets out its mission statement that languages are essential, valuable and exciting, and that language issues should be raised at the highest levels of government and be brought to the consciousness of the country as a whole. I therefore wish One Voice for Languages every success in communicating this vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorna, for that very informative insight, not only into your own research, but into your work here in Trinity. We have a little surprise for you now, our assembled guests. If this works for me, I'll be absolutely delighted. Yes. Now, we are aware that even in its infancy, the One Voice for Languages group has attracted much support and much online attention thanks to our new Facebook and website from Irish people abroad, many of whom are very well placed to appreciate the value of language learning for Irish society. Our next speaker is one such person. Do you want to? Our next speaker is one such person. He's not with us in person, but he has sent us an e-card of greetings if you wish. Robert O'Dowd is originally from Clare, but he now teaches EFL and Applied Linguistics and is Secretary for International Training at the University of León in Spain. He has taught English at universities in Ireland, Germany and Spain, and has published widely on the application of online technologies for the development of intercultural competence in foreign language learners. And this is the message he has sent for us this evening.
Let me just talk for a couple of minutes about what I see are the value of language learning. Sure, at your meeting this morning, many people are going to mention the ability the fact that it facilitates mobility, and also that it increases employment possibilities for young people. And I appreciate that in times of terrible crisis that we're experiencing both in Ireland and Spain and across Europe, that the ability of making young graduates more employable is very, very important. But let's not forget the other values of language learning. Languages carry a huge cultural value as well. And it's very important to be aware that understanding somebody in English is not the same as understanding somebody in their own language. We all realize that English is the lingua franca of the world, and that the rest of the world is is very busy trying to learn English. But that doesn't mean that we should sit back and assume that we shouldn't be learning, we Irish people, shouldn't be learning other languages. There's so much that one learns when one learns a foreign language, much more than just the words and the grammar. You learn all about the way different body language works in different languages, the cultural expressions and the proverbs that can never really be translated. Subtle things like the levels of directness in the way people address you. What is considered polite in some cultures and what is considered polite in others. Okay, all of these things, people can never learn them and never truly understand them unless they sit down and try to learn a foreign language. Another language is quite simply another way of seeing the world. And all of us who have grown up in Ireland, they say that when the Irish language dies, not only does the language die, but also a way of seeing the world will die. This is never going to happen. And we all know wonderful examples of Irish, of the way the use of indirectness in Irish, the avoidance of the word no, the way the Irish language is so full of culture, and in the same way all other languages are full of their cultures too. And students have the right, I think really they have the right to experience these other cultures. I read about in the mission statement for the One Voice for Languages group that there are so many new immigrants coming into Ireland. In my hometown in Ennis, I see that, which is full of people from, well, mostly from Poland, I think, but also from Romania and other countries. And I really think that by encouraging students to learn languages in school, you're going to help them become more tolerant to other people who are living in their country. Because our students will become more aware of what it involves to learn a foreign language, and how difficult it is, and how intricate it is. Okay, so all of these things are good. So let me finish by wishing you all the very best of luck with your initiative. I think it is very valuable. It's coming at the right time, and I will be able to support your initiative in the future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
You have no idea how relieved I am that worked. Now, so back to our panel. Barbara Nolan is head of the European Commission representation in Ireland, just around the corner from us here in Dawson Street. Prior to this, she was attached to the European Commission in Brussels and was in charge of the policies of reform and modernisation of the higher education and Erasmus student exchange programmes. She's held a number of other management positions in the Commission, including, amongst others, positions in the area of anti-discrimination policy and communications. So could I ask you to please join with me in welcoming our next speaker, Barbara Nolan.
Thank you, Tanya. I hope you can all see me. I'm quite small. I have a sense of déjà vu because 2 years ago, roughly, I was in this very room at a meeting to try to get things going to promote the learning of foreign languages and underlining how important it was. Actually, my notes are very similar to what I said on that occasion. So for those of you who were there, you may want to leave the room now. But I'm really hopeful that with the launch of One Voice for Languages, that I won't be in this room 2 years from now saying the same thing again. So I'm a bit. My message isn't totally optimistic, but I do think that there is optimism to be had with the creation of this group. I mean, I am going to give you the Philistine position on this in a way because we are struggling at the moment to find Irish people to work in the European institutions. Those who were recruited around the time Ireland joined the EU and indeed in the years that followed are now coming to the age of retirement, and there's an absolute cliff coming up. And unfortunately, Irish people are doing very, very badly in the recruitment situation. We have had, I'll just give you one set of figures which shows the impact of lack of language proficiency. In 2012, over 45,000 graduates applied to the EU institution to work at the graduate grade, the administrator grade. Of these, only 338 were from Ireland, which in itself is an issue that we could look at another day. But only one of the 338 Irish applicants was eventually recruited, which is really, really shocking. And how is that possible when, the Eurostat figures tell us that, Ireland has the highest rate of third level graduates if you look at the 30 to 34 age group. What's coupled with the fact that English-speaking graduates are at a premium. I mean, most of the drafting, for example, of EU legislation takes place in English. If you're an English language speaker, you wind up actually doing a lot of linguistic work, even though that may not be your speciality. So we would have expected the Irish graduates to have a distinct advantage in some ways. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is that any graduate applying to work in the EU institutions now has to be able to operate in 3 of the EU's official languages. And this must include one of the following: English, French or German. But in addition, if English is your mother tongue or if German is your mother tongue, you must sit the competition in another one of those languages so that you don't have a huge advantage over people who are competing from other linguistic groups. Kristen said English is not enough, and that is indeed my message too. I mean, the sad reality is that Irish graduates are not able to compete with their counterparts in other EU member states when it comes to foreign language ability. And that is, I'm afraid, the short and long of it. I would just to say that, when I'm talking about linguistic ability, yes, we do have a lot of positions for people who are specialists in languages, such as interpreters and translators. But for most of the jobs, we're looking for all of these languages and your professional qualification, your degree in law, your solicitors, your accountancy, whatever. And it's just, there are plenty of graduates out there all over Europe who can meet all of these conditions. That is the reality. So, I don't think I need to labour it, but I would just like to remind people that Ireland has we have an education and training priorities for 2020, and Ireland is a signatory to that or has agreed to that. And one of those priorities is that by 2020, the member states have agreed to ensure that their citizens would be able to communicate in at least 2 languages in addition to their mother tongue. Now, I think we all know that in Ireland's case, it would take an absolute miracle for this agreement to be met or kept in that case. And, we've heard some of Tanya, you mentioned, Ireland is the only EU member state in which it's not compulsory to learn a foreign language. If we look at primary school level, the 2010 Eurostat report shows us that only a tiny proportion of Irish primary school students are exposed to a foreign language in any meaningful way. And in this regard, Ireland is by far the worst of the EU member states. And we're now 28, so it's worst of quite a big group of countries now. And indeed, even if we look at teacher training, the colleges of education, my understanding is they don't even require a Leaving Cert qualification in a foreign language as a condition of entry. Is that true?
I think they do.
Yes. Universities, yeah, but teacher training colleges?
I think they do. Maybe we can clarify that.
I don't think so, yeah. Well, that was what I was told. On the other hand, at secondary school level in Ireland, many students do learn a foreign language in practice, but Eurostat figures show us again that by the time Irish students reach the senior cycle in secondary school, 19% have dropped the foreign language. This is not as bad as the UK. We're second worst only in that regard. In the UK, nearly 51% of secondary school students have dropped the foreign language by the time they reach the senior cycle. So, I think it is a pretty grim situation. I think at times of high unemployment, when we've messages, and I don't want to steal what the next speaker is going to say, where we have, messages from US multinationals like PayPal telling us that they're having to go outside of Ireland to recruit people because of the language situation. And at a time when our politicians are wringing their hands about youth unemployment, I find it astonishing that this is not taken more seriously. I really do. It should be an absolute priority. It is, we have to really get this going, and maybe it's the economic argument that will be the one in the end that will actually see some action. Tanya, you mentioned the primary school initiative. We too were very dismayed to see that little glimmer of light extinguished by the Department of Education. It is a really serious situation, and I think it is abundantly clear that without a comprehensive strategy and parallel investment in language learning, the Irish education system is leaving students at a distinct disadvantage compared to their EU peers. And I try to leave on a positive note, because I have been down this road before. One other thing. I wanted to read you a quote, and I'll offer €5 to whoever tells me who said this, right? Quote, "At a time of economic recession, Ireland should be focusing its efforts on language teaching." This person, unquote, this person went on to say that this focus will be, quote, "vitally important if our economy is ever to recover." Hey! I've only one fiver though. Of course, when he was in opposition, indeed. So perhaps the time has come to remind him of what he did say then, because I think we could all agree with what he said then. Anyway, on that note, I'd like to wrap up by congratulating Kristen and all her colleagues and One Voice for Languages. I'm very excited at this initiative, and I think the time has come now for all of those who believe in the importance of language learning to join together and make the case to policymakers, and you would certainly have the European Commission's support in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I don't really know where to start about commenting on that, because I think she has hit the nail on the head in so many respects. I know at the time of our little battle with the department about the MLPSI ending, we did a lot of research in terms of our preparation to speak to the Joint Oireachtas Committee, and lots of stats kept coming up. But an interesting term came up that I remember, that employers internationally are looking for something what they're calling now in OECD reports international competence. And it's not just to be able to speak languages, it's languages and your other professional skills. And I remember as a very young girl, that was brought home to me in the most straightforward way. When I was in second year in UCG, I went on Erasmus to Bologna, and I thought I was a great girl, packing my bags and going off to study Italian in Italy. And one of my best friends there, who's still a great friend to this day, was Belgian. And I discovered very quickly that as well as speaking her native Flemish, French, German, English, Spanish and Italian, she was in Bologna to study law. So she put me in my box. But anyway, I think your points were very well made and very well received. Moving on. Last but not most definitely not least, like our other speakers, our final guest this evening also really needs no introduction, as he has been a faithful advocate of language learning during his tenure as Head of Education, Social and Innovation Policy in the Irish Business and Employers Confederation, IBEC. Tony Donohue has worked with the Confederation for over 25 years in a number of roles, including Publications Editor and Head of Research and Information Services. He is a member of the National Economic and Social Council, the Expert Group on Future Skills Needs, the Business Europe Social Affairs Committee and the Board of the European Centre for the Development of Vocational Training, or CDFOP as we know it. He has also served on the boards of the National Qualifications Authority of Ireland and the Equality Authority. IBEC, as you know, is the national voice of Irish business and employers and is the umbrella body for Ireland's leading business sector groups and associations. So if we could welcome Tony Donohue to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tanya. I barely recognise that person who just discovered what I do for a living, turn up at pointless meetings. But no, it's a great honour to be associated with this initiative. I suppose I'm also here to present, or to be perceived to present, the barbarians argument, the Philistine argument, emphasise the economic aspect of it. But just to let you know, I'm going to make my comments fairly short because I need to be out of here by 7 o'clock to get down to the Gate Theatre to see Bertolt Brecht's Putney Opera. So there is, I hope I'm not totally a barbarian in this conversation. I'm also going to spare you some of the economic data around this. I saw Gerard Walker here earlier from Forfuss. Gerard was author of a document that was launched last year, and I think Carson was involved with it as well, the key skills for enterprise to trade internationally, and the stats are in there, and as I say, I'm going to spare you them. I am here to present a business perspective on this. It's definitely not the only one, but it's an important one, and I was interested in Barbara's comment there that it may well be the most compelling one. I'd also sort of remind you of some of Finbarr's comments as well, and that whole idea though of shared value is actually very, very important. Ireland is per capita the largest exporter of internationally traded services in Europe at the moment. Internationally traded services are about people talking to people. It's not about commodities. So languages obviously have a critical role in that. Some of the older members of the audience, and looking around, probably not too many of you, might recall Willy Brandt, the German Chancellor of the late 60s, early 70s. And I'll have to read what he said. I just thought it was quite apposite. When you're selling and I'm buying, we speak German. But when you're buying and I'm selling, then we speak your language. And that actually is the nub of the conversation. We can't deny that English is the lingua franca. We might speculate whether it always will be. And when you see the decline of US economic dominance, and the emergence of other economies, what will go along with that. But even assuming that it remains the lingua franca, it's important to see languages as part of a competitive dynamic in this. Those people who implicitly or explicitly suggest that we shouldn't be directing our scarce educational resources towards foreign languages actually miss that point. This is part of our competitive edge. And Ireland is a small open economy. We export most of what we produce. And in fact, we're one of the most globalized economies in the developed world. Therefore, the competitiveness of our companies in the global marketplace is key. And being proficient in a language is a critical part of that competitiveness. I mean, Willy Brandt was right in that. This requirement for competitiveness operates at two levels. First, and it's the one that's already been alluded to, and probably the one that grabs most of the headlines in the media, is its impact on our ability to compete for foreign direct investment. And we constantly hear about the challenges facing high-profile multinationals, and indeed it's gratifying to see one of those companies, SAP, are publicly associated with this initiative. They've set up operations here, and it is, as Barbara was suggesting, sad and a bit ironic that they are having to go outside Ireland to recruit to fill their own language needs. But I actually think there's a much deeper issue than that, and one that doesn't grab the headlines. 85% of the value of Irish exports come from foreign-owned companies. And in the longer term, this isn't sustainable. The single greatest economic challenge we face is the development of an indigenous exporting sector. And it's something that we've never actually addressed. We've tried. Some of the older members, again, would probably remember the Telesis report back in the 70s. I suppose other waves of investment took over, foreign direct investment, and then we fell in love with property and so on. Other things have tended to take the place of it. And it is the challenge. I mean, the IDA are doing sterling work in maintaining the pipeline of high-value jobs from foreign direct investment, but they are not coming in the numbers that we require, and it's the indigenous exporting sector that we have to see for our growth. And these companies will only gain a competitive edge and successfully enter new markets with the help of other languages. I mean, better language skills are needed wherever companies interact with service providers and suppliers, as well as in sales and marketing. But unfortunately for many companies, and particularly SMEs, it's a case of not knowing what you don't know. There's evidence to support that. The EU Barometer survey suggested that only 9% of Irish SMEs saw languages as a key competitiveness factor in the next 5 to 10 years, whereas 32% was the EU average in that regard. So what tends to happen with these companies is that they don't consider markets where they perceive language and cultural differences as an entry barrier. Exporting to the UK remains the height of their ambition. And when you consider that 75% of the world's population doesn't actually speak English, and only 9% of it speaks English as its first language, this does seem like a missed opportunity. Therefore, I would agree that an important aspect of the One Voice campaign is around this awareness building, and as much awareness building amongst the business sector as the policy makers, and promoting this message. However, I also think we need to do something a bit more than this. Unfortunately, past experience would suggest that persuasive arguments aren't enough, and particularly when it comes to achieving change whose benefits will only become apparent in the long term. And again, I was thinking of the primary school project there. The young people going into primary school won't actually come into the workplace till about 2033, definitely the early 2034, 35, long after I suspect I'm considering shuffling off this mortal coil. So it seems like a long way away, and that makes it difficult to get to the attention of the policy formers. So I think this should be an alliance that is in the business of providing solutions as well. And some of these will be long-term. We've heard of the need, and we keep hearing of the need for a coherent modern language strategy, which I'd be optimistic will appear at some stage. But there are other short-term measures, and given that this event is being hosted by a School of Languages and Education, I do think higher education has got a particularly important role to play in this, in providing leadership, obviously, but also developing new pedagogies that contextualize some of this, some of the language learning in terms of its value to business and science students, for example. Now, I don't want to risk as I said, be sounding like a barbarian here, but I do think there's an important challenge there in putting language into a more general context. And more critically, I think, developing the frameworks that will facilitate language across different modern languages, including Irish. And it's gratifying to see the Irish fraternity as part of this alliance. I was thinking of this when Finbarr was making his comments, and he was talking about Japanese. I remember my own employer back in the 80s beating a path to the department, talking about the importance of Japanese and how Ireland wouldn't survive unless we all learned Japanese. From memory, there were 289 students who took Leaving Cert Japanese last summer. So there is a lesson there, and it's something that the department, quite legitimately, will throw back and say, what languages? You're talking about German now, you're talking about Mandarin, etc. So I think the education, and I'm not an expert in pedagogy, but I suspect, and maybe it will be something that will come out in the discussion, there are frameworks that can be developed that will encourage young people to take on languages, whatever language that might be, and different cultures, increase their cultural awareness. I also think there are other short-term initiatives. Sorry, thanks very much, Kristen. Am I the first one to get that? I only had that and that. I'm also heartened to see the involvement of the embassies here, because I do think the so-called heritage learners, the children of families from this new diverse Ireland, the 160 languages that Sarah was talking about, that is a potentially very powerful resource that we could tap into. So just to conclude, Tanya mentioned that memorable comment that emanated from the European Council about moving away from an official but lame bilingualism to a society where the ability to learn and use 2 or more languages taken for granted. The challenge is still there, but I believe that this initiative is actually a very important step in meeting this challenge. I congratulate the committee, who are forces of nature in this discussion, and wish you well with it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony. As always, a very inspiring contribution. Time is ticking on, and I know you have been sitting for a while, and you have all seen the wine on your way in, so you know that there is wine on the way out. I would ask you to join with me, first of all, in giving the members of our panel a very warm round of applause to thank them for their contribution. But we're not going to let them relax just yet, as now the committee of the One Voice for Languages group would like them to open the discussions. We would like to open the discussions to the floor. Do you want me to turn it on? Are we good? You just press it. Anne has a roving microphone, and so if we could ask you, if any of you have any questions or comments for any members of the panel, if you could just put up your hand. And in order to allow as many people as possible to join in, if I could just ask you to preface your comment by introducing yourself and what organisation you're with, and just to keep your comments as succinct as possible. So is there anybody who'd like to make a comment or a suggestion or a question?
I'm just going, while I give this to Tanya, I'm just going to say we're really going to keep this as short as possible. I'd invite you to use your comment cards for anything you really want to bring forward, because we've so rely on the time, and it's well past the time that we would have advertised, and we really love you to go line. So we're just going to take 3 comments if there are them.
Yeah.
Put them on your comment cards if there are others, and please bring the discussion out to where the wine is. So if anyone has something they'd like to bring, yeah.
Maura. I don't know, is that working, Maura? Can we hear you?
that it? Right, I think that's it, sorry. I normally have a loud enough voice to carry anyway. I'm Maura Clancy. I'm currently a modern languages tutor with the post-primary programme in Hibernia College. And just a little testimony to the power of learning modern languages in the primary school. I had a student who was going to teach Spanish 2 years ago, and she had done Spanish in the primary school for 2 years, had not done it at second level, and was perfectly well able to take it up at third level, and is, as far as I know, a very successful teacher. Just a very interesting little testimony.
Thank you, Maura. Back to the room there, Anne. Thank you.
We have such a huge resource now with all these non-national.
Sorry, can I just ask you to introduce yourself?
My name is Paul Keane. A question: with such a huge resource now of all these non-nationals that have come into the country, with families that speak French and Spanish and Italian and Chinese, how do we organise matters so that we ensure these children don't lose these languages, that it isn't submerged in this lake of English in which they've been plonked? Thank you.
Lorna, would you like to?
Well, the first thing we do is we teach those languages and we recognise their economic value. Thank you. The first thing we do is we actually include them in our curriculum rather than in after-schools clubs or on Saturdays, and we train teachers who can teach them. So rather than having someone's mum who's quite a good Arabic teacher but has never really done it before, we actually train people to come into the curriculum and teach. Until those languages are recognised, we will continue to talk about other languages and French, German, Italian and Spanish. So, and actually I think nowadays if you're a fluent speaker of English, Arabic and Spanish, you're more likely to get a decent job. So there's the economic argument as well. But first of all, we teach them in our curriculum and we train teachers. Short answer.
Okay. Next question or comment, please. Don't be shy. Thank you. Anya.
I'm afraid this will be next and last. I'm going to be the policer on this. Thank you. Okay, Anya Furlong from WIT. I think there was a reference to language use, which is really at the heart of the problems around language. And I think we have to think about using languages in different ways, not just for communicating, but language maybe to solve problem, and language to develop this ambiguous space, languages to develop this ambiguous space Finbarr was talking about, where different ways of thinking and processing information can happen, and there are ways of doing this. So expanding the understanding of language use.
Thank you. I think we're all agreed in terms of the added values that languages can bring in so many different dimensions.
Finbarr, please do. One small comment on that. I think there's too much emphasis at the moment on, I said it in my talk, on the teacher, if you will, giving things. Now, I'm not talking specifically about language when I say that, but every classroom I go into now, students are on the internet, they have iPads, etc. I would move the emphasis away from, I'm not saying that teaching a language, you still need to teach it, don't get me wrong, but I would, and I see this in the work I do myself, you create an environment where the student himself or herself has to draw from this incredible resource which is in every classroom in the country now, in order to have a conversation with other people in the classroom, either in that language or in other languages. Because it's in that dynamic, I think, that you create the reason why the language will have a great demand in the future. I'm convinced that that's the business case. There is a strong business case based on foreign companies. I taught myself a lot of people in PayPal, but my argument is actually based on the indigenous companies. I think the driving force that's missing, and I see it at all levels of Irish education, the driving force that I think is missing is a sense of identity, a sense of values, a sense of, I see it in my German students. My German students turn up in classroom on time, they leave on time, they send me notes when they're missing. I have Irish students that don't seem to care that much. Now, I think we should spend more time focusing on that kind of thing, because it's out of that, it's in there that I believe that the language issue is really losing some. You know, that if you don't have that spirit, if you're not prepared to do hard work, if you're not prepared to work hard at home in order to you won't have the languages that Barbara talked about. I think that's actually the missing ingredient. It's a fundamental flaw, I think, in our way of teaching. And it's not about languages, it's about values of it.
We have one last, or will we have a drink? One last and a drink, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll be short. My name is Henry Lepellet. I'm a coordinator for Chinese language teaching, and I teach Chinese in DAT. And I would totally agree with the value. Knowing where you come from, and I think our students here, Irish students, don't know where they come from. I had a couple of shocks today. I should not be shocked by some things Irish students don't know, but it still happens. I was making a comparison. I won't go on. There's so many things I would love to say, but maybe this example will explain. My students, none of my students, from year 1 to year 2, year 3, year 4, none of my students today knew where the word boycott comes from. So this is a problem because these students are learning Chinese. My students think this is a real case, think Hong Kong is the capital of Japan. So it's about, so what is happening in secondary school where you pass French? I know the case of French. Students who had not 5 words of French managed to pass Leaving Cert honors with a B by going to one of the grind schools. So I think it's about knowing where you come from, having a value. If you know where you come from, whether it's in Irish or English, if you're an Irish speaker or an English speaker, and you think English is your culture, not just an international language. If you know you want to communicate this, and you realize if you want to communicate this, oh, well, I have to also learn where they're from, what they have to say, what is, as was said, the ambiguity of being Irish, ambiguity of being German, of being Korean, Japanese, and so on. So we have to start, maybe not in primary school, but we have to make sure that people know where they come from and where they're heading. Okay, a little bit simplistic, but maybe.
Okay, thank you very much. I think just to conclude, in my many years with the Primary Initiative, one of the most heartening aspects of our work was that teachers involved in the programme were constantly saying to us that through their interaction and learning of another language, it really brought home to them the value of their own languages and their own culture. And many of our teachers said that not only did they realise all of a sudden that Irish was the language, but they actually began to appreciate Irish language and Irish culture. So I think language can be a wonderful vehicle in terms of addressing the issues of values, of heritage, of identity. We're going to finish up. Anne is going to finish on behalf of Trinity, but on behalf of the committee, can I just thank you all very much for coming. I know many of you have travelled considerable distances to be with us this evening. Can I please reiterate that we would really genuinely love to get your comments on this evening's launch and your ideas for future events, because as Kirsten very clearly outlined, this we hope will be the first of many events that will focus firmly on the issue of language learning of all languages for Ireland as a country. Some of the things we're toying with at the moment include a research conference which could showcase language skills in this country. We're going to keep in touch with you. Many of you have already seen our Facebook page, and we also have a new website, www.onevoiceforlanguages.com. So if I could ask you to take the mission statement, the lovely bookmark that you have, and bring them back to your organisations. Please encourage colleagues to follow us. Hopefully we'll be getting more press coverage, and hopefully we will be invited to contribute more to ongoing policy discussions and reforms. And as Tony very positively alluded to, the possible arrival of a languages and education policy, that's the most exciting thing I've heard in a long time. Anne.
Okay. It remains for me just to say thanks very much to Tanya and to Kristen as moderators for the evening. Thank you. Thank you very much to our speakers who've put a lot of thought and effort into this. Thank you very much. I'll just do one quick one. Thank you very much to you all for your participation and attention, and most of all, especially because we're going out to some wonderful wines, we're going out to some lovely food, and it is all very wonderfully provided by our sponsors who I won't name them again, but they are up on our website, and they we'll put them up here in a moment. But thank you so much for your for coming and for your
sponsorship. And so I invite you to Food and Wine outside.
Yeah, it probably would have